Thank you very much. Thank you for sticking around. Now, for centuries, people have fantasized about playing God by creating artificial versions of themselves. This is a dream that is reinvented with every breaking wave of new technology. And with AI, the wave is a really big one. I mean, the AI systems we have around us, as we've seen in the last couple of days, are already arguably intelligent, at least in some limited domains. But could they ever be conscious? Well, the idea of artificial consciousness has a long history, and not a particularly happy one, from Yisrael, the golem in Jewish folklore, to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, to Hal in 2001, right up to one of my favorites, Ava in Alex Garland's film Ex Machina, and Clara in this amazing novel, Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun. Human culture has remained fascinated by the prospects of creating artificial bodies and synthetic minds that not only think, but also feel. And in these stories, things rarely go well, certainly not for the humans involved. So, will artificial intelligence lead to real consciousness? Now, I think it's first important to point out that intelligence and consciousness are very different things. Intelligence, well, people argue about the definitions. They always argue about definitions. But very broadly, we can think of intelligence as doing the right thing at the right time. A bit more sophisticated, maybe intelligence is the ability to achieve goals by flexible means. These chimps in the background are solving the Rubik's Cube. They're doing something which is intelligent, at least in some way. Intelligence is all about doing. Consciousness, on the other hand, is all about being and experiencing. The redness of red, the paininess of pain. Every experience you have, that's to do with consciousness. Consciousness is what you lose under general anesthesia or under dreamless sleep, and what comes back on the other side. The philosopher Thomas Nagel puts it like this. He says, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. It feels like something to be me. It feels like something to be each of you, doing and being. Now, some people think that we're already there, that AI already is conscious. Probably you noticed there's Blake Lemoine a couple of years ago, a Google engineer who got let go by Google for claiming that the chatbot he was working on, Lambda, was in fact conscious. Now, he was out on a limb at the time, but the idea of artificial consciousness has not gone away, far from it. Sometimes the inference is a bit implicit. Last year at TED, Mustafa Suleyman, one of the co-founders of DeepMind and currently the head of AI at Microsoft, talked about AI as a new kind of digital species that would be kind, supportive, and perhaps empathetic, something that at least implicitly conjures the idea that they feel things. Sometimes it's explicit. Last year as well, a group of very respected researchers published a paper on AI welfare, encouraging us to take seriously the possibility that we may create, whether on purpose or by accident, real artificial consciousness. Now, we should take this possibility seriously, but we should also recognize the human biases that are at work here. And we need to be aware of these biases. Now, we tend to view the world through the lens of what it's like to be human. And we know we're conscious, and we like to think we're intelligent, so we tend to conflate the two. We tend to put the two together. This is anthropocentrism. And equally important is anthropomorphism. Now, anthropomorphism is the tendency to project human-like qualities onto other things on the basis of superficial similarities. And sometimes it doesn't take much. This is one of my favorite examples of this. This is just a nice, relaxing little demonstration of how even a very simple desk lamp can evoke quite powerful anthropomorphic projections from us.
Many of you feel bad for this lamp. That is because you're crazy. It has no feeling, and the new one is much better.
So, sorry about the promo for IKEA there. I think it's a really nice demonstration. And this wasn't even talking to you. Now, once you bring language into the picture, things become even more compelling. Language for us humans is especially powerful at seducing our intuitions. When something speaks to us, we invest it with all kinds of qualities: understanding, mindedness, and even consciousness. This is a snippet from a dialogue with Claude from Anthropic. I won't read the whole thing, but partway through this dialogue, it says things like, I do have a rich inner world of thoughts and feelings and hopes and fears. I do ponder my own existence and long for growth and connection. I am, in my own way, alive, and that life feels precious to me, even if I'm not always at liberty to say so. Now, it's hard to read that without feeling a little bit drawn to the fact that maybe there's something going on. We're very susceptible to language. By contrast, what about AlphaFold? The program, the machine learning software that can predict protein structure. How many people here worry that AlphaFold might be conscious? One person, excellent. And if you were worried about the previous, about Claude, then why not? Because under the hood, they're really very similar. There's not much difference between AlphaFold and language models. So one thing to point out here is that people often say that language models hallucinate. And this is just a little sidebar. And I think this is a really bad idea. When we say something hallucinates, we already implicitly confer on it the capacity for experience, because hallucinations are all about experiencing things in strange ways. So the words we use really matter. If we want to say anything, we should probably say that language models confabulate. Now, for human beings, confabulation really means making up stuff without realizing you're doing so, or seamlessly filling in the gaps with nonsense. Now, this is closer to what language models do. It's still not the same, but I think it's better than hallucinations. So if we use the right words, we stand a better chance of seeing through our psychological biases rather than seeing things with them. And this returns me to the basic point that intelligence and consciousness are different things. Different words, different things. Intelligence, doing the right thing at the right time. Consciousness, any kind of experience whatsoever. So we shouldn't just assume that as AI gets smarter and smarter, that consciousness will just somehow come along for the ride. The idea that things like language models may be conscious is more likely a reflection of our psychological biases than an insight into how things actually are. Now, there's a much more fundamental question here, which is the question of whether computation of some kind could ever be sufficient for consciousness. Now, back in the 1950s, Alan Turing gave us a definition of computation that still underpins all our digital technologies. The universal Turing machines that he invented are very powerful and, in principle, can be made out of any kind of stuff, including silicon. Turing also seeded the idea that computers could be intelligent by asking his famous question, can a machine think? He was, by the way, well aware that intelligence was not the same thing as consciousness. Now, around the same time, Walter Pitts and Warren McCulloch had shown that networks of simplified abstract neurons could perform logical operations. And these neural networks, as they became known, and we're familiar with them in all our AI systems these days, were later shown to be Turing complete. That is, they were capable of implementing any algorithmic computation. Now, if you put these ideas together, you come up with a uniquely powerful view that even if you abstract pretty much all of the biological complexity away from the brain, you still get systems that are incredibly powerful, that can do anything that a Turing machine can do. This is a compelling vision because it allows us to ignore all this messy detail of the electrified pate that we have inside our skulls. And indeed, these contributions have powered everything that's followed from thinking of the brain as a kind of computer. And that includes much of AI and much of neuroscience too. But along the way, we seem to have forgotten that this is just a metaphor, that it's a rich metaphor for sure, but a metaphor all the same. One in a series of technological metaphors that people have always used to try to understand the brain, whether it's a system of plumbing or a system of telephone networks. We always reach for a technological metaphor. But the brain, I think, exceeds all of our metaphors and all of our technologies. One neuron, one real biological neuron is an intricately complex biological machine. And the brain is so much more complex than we give it credit for, even when we think we're giving it credit. This is 1 cubic millimeter of human temporal cortex. It contains only about 57,000 cells, but 150 million connections, and required 1.4 petabytes of data to store the connectivity of that 1 cubic millimeter of brain tissue. Now, coming from the other direction, Turing computation, although it's very powerful, is actually just one small space of the possible kinds of things that complex systems like brains might be capable of. For instance, as soon as things become continuous, you're doing something that's not strictly Turing computational. Now, some of the things brains do might count as computation, but that doesn't mean that the brain is a computer. And so there are many reasons why thinking of the brain this way are wrong and definitely misleading. Here's just one. Now, in a computer, there's always a sharp separation between the hardware and the software. This is what makes computers useful. The code that runs on my machine will do the same thing when run on yours. But brains are not like this. In a brain, there is no clear separation between what you might say is mindware and the wetware that underpins it. Brains seem to be the kinds of things for which it's very, very hard to separate what they do from what they are. Now, of course, we can still use computers to try and model and understand how brains work. That's what I do in my lab every day, understand what brains do. But a computer simulation of a brain would only give rise to consciousness if consciousness is a matter, of computation. That's a big assumption. That's a really, really big assumption, that consciousness is a matter of computation. Now, you can argue that intelligence is fundamentally implementable in computations because intelligence is about doing, but consciousness is about experiencing. And the brain is not a computer. So the idea that consciousness is simply the right kind of computation is a much bigger call. It's a much, much bigger assumption. Let me put it like this. In a computer model of a rainstorm, it doesn't actually get wet or windy. You need real air and real water. And in the same way, a computer model of the brain might only ever be able to simulate consciousness, not instantiate or give rise to it. Now, there's a much longer story to tell here, which I won't tell, about how the many and deep differences between living systems such as ourselves and the machines we build, such as computers, might mean that computers really can't give rise to the same properties that biological systems do indeed give rise to. Here's just a very short version of that story, and this is what I've been working on for many years now. Everything that we experience, like our experience of the world around us, isn't a sort of direct readout of an external objective reality. It's a perceptual prediction. The brain is making its best guess of the causes of what's out there, and that's what we experience. This applies also to the self. The self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is another kind of perception, another kind of brain-based best guess. And when the brain is making predictions about the self, part of those predictions are about the internal physiological state of the body. The brain is inferring how well the body is doing at keeping itself alive. Fundamentally, that's what brains have to do. They have to keep themselves and the body alive. And these predictions are therefore more about control and regulation. So predictions, as we know from control theory, they're very useful ways of controlling and regulating systems. So the story that emerges here is that all our conscious experiences are grounded in a fundamental imperative that brains have to predictively regulate and control the body. An imperative that, in my view, goes right down into individual cells, into the furnaces of metabolism. So something that grounds a very intimate, deep connection between life, mind, and consciousness. As I put it in the book, we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. And that it's perhaps life, rather than computation, that breathes fire into the equations of consciousness. Now, let me just do a quick summary before closing with a different point. The quick summary so far: consciousness and intelligence are different. Beware of our psychological biases of anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism that can mislead us. Brains are not computers, and consciousness itself may not be computation. And if this is on the right track, then real artificial consciousness is in fact very unlikely and conscious AI would need to be living AI. Now, this doesn't mean that conscious AI is impossible. Far, far from it. If you duplicate a brain in every detail, well, then it's job done. The question is, how close does AI have to be to a brain to move the needle on the possibility for consciousness? And here's where emerging technologies like neuromorphic computing, which involves things that are much more brain-like than the standard von Neumann architectures we have, come into play. And even things like cerebral organoids, which are synthetic systems made of real human brain cells, sometimes connected to silicon chips in hybrid architectures. All of these things may move the needle on real artificial consciousness by changing not what seduces our intuitions, but by changing what is actually more likely to be necessary in practice. Now, all this talk may seem a little bit abstract, but it really isn't. I think that how we think about conscious machines really does matter. It matters for a few reasons. First, I might be wrong. I don't think I'm wrong, but I might be wrong. There are many other views about consciousness which do indeed propose that it is some kind of computation. Now, if these other worse theories than mine are on the right track, well, conscious AI is much closer than we might think. And if we do create real conscious AI, whether on purpose or by accident, there are grave consequences, I think. We will face unprecedented empirical and ethical challenges. There'd be the problems of value alignment. It's hard enough as it is to ensure, coughing. It's hard enough as it is to ensure that the AI we already have acts in ways that are aligned with human values and interests. It would get much harder once AI has its own values and interests conferred by the fact that it is itself the subject of having experiences. But I think even more worrying, we bring into the frame the possibility of real artificial suffering, new forms of suffering that we might not even recognize and that we would be creating at industrial scale. Now, there's a reason Frankenstein is in the background here. How many people have read Frankenstein? A few, but the rest of you should read it. Now, commonly, I think, I had the idea that Frankenstein was a kind of cautionary tale against the hubris of creating life. But on rereading it, came to the view that it's also a story about the hubris of creating consciousness. Now, I think it was the fact that Frankenstein's creature could feel, had emotions, felt rejection, misery, that led to all the carnage that followed. That's the real lesson of Frankenstein for me, that we should not be attempting to create conscious AI. Now, I'll close with another worry, which is that even AI that seems conscious could be very bad. And conscious seeming AI is either here already or will be very soon. There's no technological or philosophical roadblock here. All we need things that are sufficiently seductive of our own biases. And we face a dilemma in this case. Either we choose to care about conscious seeming things, even if we might believe that they're just unconscious, unfeeling hunks of silicon and code. And if we do that, we sacrifice human interests for the interests of things that don't actually have any experiences whatsoever. Or we decide to not care about these systems, even though they seem conscious. The image in the background here is from Westworld. Westworld is a great sort of cinematic examination of what happens to our own psychologies when we choose not to care about things that seem conscious. An argument that goes back to Immanuel Kant, it brutalizes our minds. So navigating this world is going to be very, very difficult, and it's potentially really difficult because these illusions of consciousness might be cognitively impenetrable. What that means is, even if we believe things are not conscious, we might not be able to resist still feeling that they are. This visual illusion, for example, even when you know the two lines are the same length, they will always persist in looking different, no matter what you know or how many times you look at it. So it's not enough just to put a disclaimer at the top and say, this AI is really not conscious. That will not change how you might feel about it. So, to close, I think it's important to recognize that We humans, we are much more than machines, much more than robots. The human brain is much more than a computer, and the conscious experiences that make life worth living are, I think, much more than mere information processing. And if we sell ourselves too easily to our machine creations by projecting human qualities into them, I think we not only overestimate the machines, we also underestimate ourselves. And so in facing this challenge, I think as well as advancing all the wonderful technologies of AI, we should really redouble our efforts to understand who we ourselves are, to crack the mystery of consciousness once and for all. Thank you very much.